Before watching, please press like to support me in producing more stories. This helps in spreading the video and reaching more people. Thank you for your support and enjoy watching. It was just another day at the facility, if just another day could ever describe a place like this. My name is Barrett Crane, and I've spent the last 10 years working for the US government on a project that, if it ever saw the light of day, would make headlines around the world. Project Revenant, they called it. The goal was to create the perfect soldier, a being that could regenerate, adapt to any environment, and operate autonomously in the most hostile conditions. We were given a remote facility deep in the Montana wilderness, miles from civilization, to conduct our work. For years, the team and I had been carefully manipulating genetic codes, splicing DNA and running endless tests. And for years we had failed. Until we didn't. The facility itself was a sprawling underground complex with cold metallic hallways that seemed to stretch on forever. Each section was more secure than the last, requiring multiple layers of clearance to access. It was easy to lose track of time down there, with no windows and a constant hum of machinery filling the air. The sterile environment was designed to keep the outside world from interfering with our work, and to keep our work from interfering with the outside world. A few months ago, the first promising result emerged, a creature we dubbed Subject 37. It was a hybrid, a mix of human DNA with something else, something that could only be described as otherworldly. At first glance, Subject 37 looked almost human, but with strange, elongated limbs and a distorted, almost reptilian skin texture that shimmered under the harsh fluorescent lights. Its movements were jerky, unpredictable, like a marionette controlled by an invisible puppeteer. But what set Subject 37 apart was its ability to heal at an astonishing rate. We had finally succeeded in creating a being that could survive just about anything, but there were side effects, unintended consequences that no one had anticipated. The creature's intelligence grew rapidly, almost too rapidly. Within weeks, it had developed a rudimentary understanding of language, and within months, it could solve complex puzzles designed to test its cognitive abilities. But with intelligence came something else, an awareness, a curiosity, and eventually a sense of rebellion. Last night, everything went to hell. It started with a security breach, alarms blaring through the facility, red lights flashing in every corridor. I was in my lab running routine tests when the power flickered and died. A split second later, the emergency generators kicked in, but by then, the damage had been done. Subject 37 was loose. I grabbed the nearest weapon, a standard-issue Glock we kept for emergencies, and bolted down the hallway. The place was a maze, but I knew it like the back of my hand. As I turned a corner, I nearly collided with Dr. Evelyn Morse, one of the lead geneticists on the project. Her face was pale, eyes wide with fear. "It's out," she gasped, barely able to catch her breath. "We need to shut it down, now." Together, we made our way to the central control room where we could initiate a facility-wide lockdown. The hallways were eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of the ventilation system and the occasional unnerving thud that echoed through the walls. Every step we took felt like it could be our last. When we reached the control room, we found it in shambles. The screens that monitored every inch of the facility were shattered, wires hanging loose from the walls, sparks flying from damaged equipment. And there, in the middle of the room, was the body of one of the security officers. His throat slashed open, eyes staring lifelessly at the ceiling. I didn't have time to process the sight before a loud crash from behind us made both Evelyn and me jump. We spun around, guns drawn, but the hallway was empty. Or at least it appeared to be. "It's playing with us," Evelyn whispered, voice trembling. I didn't respond. I was too focused on the task at hand. I moved quickly to the central console, hoping against hope that I could still access the lockdown sequence. My hands flew over the keyboard, inputting codes, bypassing security protocols, until finally, the system responded. "Lockdown initiated," the automated voice announced, and a heavy clunk echoed through the facility as the door sealed shut. We were trapped, but so was Subject 37. Or so I thought. A noise, A low, guttural noise came from the vents above us. The kind of noise that made your skin crawl, that you felt deep in your bones. I looked up just in time to see something move, something fast and barely visible in the darkness. Evelyn screamed and I raised my gun, firing blindly into the vent, but it was too late. A moment later she was gone, pulled into the darkness, her screams echoing through the empty hallways. I stood there, frozen, trying to process what had just happened. But there was no time to think, only to act. I couldn't fight this thing, not like this. I needed a plan. I made my way through the facility, keeping to the shadows, avoiding the main corridors where I knew it would be hunting. My mind raced, trying to come up with a way to outsmart a creature that was designed to be smarter than us. And then it hit me. Subject 37 wasn't invincible. It was still a biological entity, and like any biological entity, it had a weakness. I remembered the experimental toxins we had been working on, designed to neutralize any unforeseen consequences of our genetic experiments. They were stored in the biohazard lab a few floors down. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot I had. The journey to the biohazard lab was harrowing. The facility was eerily silent, the kind of silence that's so loud it makes your ears ring. I moved quickly but cautiously, every shadow a potential threat, every corner a possible ambush. Twice I thought I saw something move in the periphery of my vision, but when I turned, there was nothing there. Finally, I reached the lab. The door was slightly ajar, which immediately set off alarm bells in my head. I entered slowly, gun raised, scanning the room for any sign of movement. The lab was a mess. Equipment overturned, glass shattered, and in the corner another body, this one barely recognizable. But the toxins were still there, stored in a reinforced case on the far side of the room. I moved quickly, retrieving the vials and loading them into a specialized dart gun we kept for such emergencies. The plan was simple: lure Subject 37 into a trap and inject it with enough toxin to knock it out for good. I left the lab, my heart pounding in my chest. The plan might have been simple, but executing it was another matter entirely. I needed to find the creature first, and that meant putting myself in danger. I headed for the main research chamber, the largest, most open space in the facility. If I were Subject 37, that's where I'd go. The place where it had been born, where it had been kept, where it had been made to suffer. The place where it would feel most powerful. When I reached the chamber, I found it empty, but I knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. I positioned myself near the entrance, hiding in the shadows, dart gun at the ready. All I could do now was wait. Minutes passed, maybe hours. It was hard to tell. Time seemed to stretch, every second an eternity. My mind started to wander, thinking about all the things that had led to this moment, about all the mistakes we had made, about the price of playing God. And then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound like the rustling of leaves. It was here. I tensed, finger on the trigger as I watched the entrance. Slowly, almost gracefully, Subject 37 emerged from the shadows. Its form was even more grotesque up close. The elongated limbs, the distorted features, the shimmering reptilian skin. But what struck me most were its eyes. Eyes that were too human, filled with a kind of cold, calculating intelligence that sent a chill down my spine. It didn't see me at first. It moved slowly, cautiously, as if it knew it was being watched but didn't know from where. I waited, heart pounding in my chest, until it was close enough. Then, with a quick practiced motion, I stepped out of the shadows and fired. The dart hit its mark, embedding itself in the creature's side. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the creature turned to face me, eyes narrowing as if it understood what I had done. It took a step toward me, and then another, but its movements were sluggish, uncoordinated. The toxin was working. I watched as Subject 37 stumbled, its limbs growing heavier with each step. Finally, it collapsed to the ground, its body twitching as it struggled to resist the effects of the toxin. I approached cautiously, keeping the gun trained on it, ready to fire again if necessary. But it wasn't necessary. The creature's movements grew weaker and weaker until finally it lay still. I stood there for a long time, just staring at it, waiting for it to move again, but it didn't. It was over. I holstered the gun and left the chamber, not looking back. There was nothing left for me here. I had done my job. As I walked through the empty halls of the facility, I thought about what would happen next, about the cleanup teams that would arrive, about the reports that would be filed, about the questions that would be asked. But those were problems for another day. For now, I just needed to get out of this place. The elevator doors closed behind me, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I let out a long, slow breath. The creature was dead, and I was still alive. The end? I suppose, but more importantly, the beginning of something new, something that could have only been realized by witnessing the impossible. There's something unsettling about silence, especially when you've been trained to notice the things that most people overlook. I work as a senior geneticist for a division of the U.S. government that officially doesn't exist. I can't tell you the name of the facility, mostly because it doesn't have one. But I can tell you that it's buried deep within a mountain, far from any prying eyes or innocent hikers who might stumble upon it. My job is to conduct genetic experiments, the kind that would make the average person lose sleep. But I'm not the average person. At least I thought I wasn't. My name is Dr. Ethan Broderick, and I've been doing this kind of work for over a decade. You'd think that would make me numb to the horrors we create, but every now and then something sneaks through the cracks that shakes you to the core. Today was one of those days. We called it Project Sable, a genetic experiment designed to combine the resilience of several species into one. We took DNA from various sources: wolverine for its ferocity, octopus for its adaptive camouflage, and wolf for its pack mentality and predatory instincts. The idea was to create something that could be controlled, weaponized even, under the right conditions. But when you play God, you often lose control of your creations. The facility is massive, with hundreds of interconnected laboratories, living quarters and containment cells. Everything is reinforced, sealed with the kind of technology that the outside world won't see for another 50 years. Or at least, that's what we thought. This morning, I was called into Lab 27. A security breach, they said, but not in the usual sense. Something had broken out of its containment. And this wasn't just any breach. This was Project Sable. I met with Agent Cooper and Dr. Yara Halliday in the lab's observation room. Both looked more shaken than I'd ever seen them. Cooper, usually stoic and unreadable, had a tension in his jaw that didn't go unnoticed. Yara was pale, clutching a tablet like it was a lifeline. "What's the situation?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level. "Sable's out," Cooper said bluntly. "It killed 3 guards in Section C before we lost track of it." "We're sure it's Sable?" I asked, knowing the answer already. Yara nodded, swallowing hard. "We've confirmed it. The footage? You need to see the footage." She handed me the tablet, and I watched the grainy black and white video feed. It showed the containment cell where Sable was housed. At first, everything seemed normal. Then, without warning, the camera feed glitched. A split second later, the steel door of the cell was torn apart like paper, and something shot out at a speed that seemed impossible. The camera didn't catch much detail, just flashes of movement, and then the feed cut out completely. "Any idea where it is now?" I asked, still processing what I had seen. Cooper shook his head. "That's the problem. The facility's lockdown protocol should have activated automatically, but it seems the system is compromised. We're dealing with a full breach." "So it's loose somewhere in the facility," I muttered, more to myself than to them. "And we're sitting ducks." "That about sums it up," Cooper replied grimly. "We need to find it and contain it before it does any more damage." "We need to kill it," Yara corrected, her voice shaking. "This thing, it's not an animal. It's..." She trailed off, and I could see the fear in her eyes. She had been part of the team that designed Sable's genetic makeup. She knew exactly what it was capable of. "Any suggestions on how we do that?" I asked, trying to keep the situation from spiraling further into panic. "We've got the security team mobilized," Cooper said, "but standard protocols won't work. We need to think outside the box. Which is why we need you," Yara added, looking at me with desperate hope. "You understand it better than anyone. You know its weaknesses." I didn't respond immediately. The truth was, Sable wasn't designed to have weaknesses. It was designed to be the perfect predator. And if it was loose in the facility, we were all in serious trouble. "We need to lure it somewhere contained where we can control the environment," I said finally. "What about the deep storage vaults? They're isolated and fortified." Cooper nodded. "That could work, but how do we get it there?" "Bait," I said simply. "It has a strong predatory instinct. We use that to our advantage." "That's risky," Yara said, but there was no other option. Risk was all we had left. We spent the next hour coordinating the plan. The deep storage vaults were located in the lowest levels of the facility, designed to house experimental materials that were too dangerous to destroy or release. The idea was to lure Sable down there, trap it, and then neutralize it by any means necessary. The bait was simple: human presence. We needed someone who could navigate the facility quickly and draw Sable's attention. We ended up selecting a member of the security team, a man named Kane Armitage, who had served in special forces before joining the project. He volunteered without hesitation, though I could see the tension in his eyes. We watched from the surveillance room as Kane made his way through the deserted corridors. The entire facility was in lockdown mode, red emergency lights casting ominous shadows as he moved. He carried a modified tranquilizer rifle, but we all knew it wouldn't be enough to stop Sable if things went wrong. "We're monitoring the creature's movement," Yara said, her voice a whisper. "It's heading towards him." Kane reached the access point to the lower levels, and for a moment, everything was quiet. Too quiet. Then the cameras picked up movement. Sable was fast, faster than anything we had anticipated. It moved like a shadow, flickering in and out of the camera's view as it closed in on Kane's position. "Get ready," I said, my voice tight. Kane opened the access door, and that's when the real horror began. The creature leaped at him, emerging from the darkness like a nightmare given form. It was unlike anything I had ever seen, a grotesque amalgamation of the DNA we had spliced together. Its skin was mottled, shifting colors to blend with its surroundings, while its limbs were unnaturally long, ending in claws that gleamed like polished steel. Its face, if you could call it that, was a horrifying blend of wolf and octopus, with a maw that opened too wide, too deep, filled with rows of sharp, serrated teeth. Kane fired the tranquilizer, but the darts barely slowed it down. Sable lunged at him, its claws tearing through his armor like tissue paper. He screamed, a sound that would haunt me if I allowed myself to dwell on it, but I couldn't. Not now. "Close the door," I shouted, and Cooper slammed the controls, sealing the access point just as the creature tried to push through. The reinforced door held, but only just. "We need to move," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "It'll find another way out if we don't act fast." We rushed to the deep storage vault, where we would try to contain the creature once and for all. The corridors seemed to stretch on forever, the shadows playing tricks on my mind. Every sound, every flicker of movement in the corner of my eye set my nerves on edge. Finally, we reached the vault. It was a massive chamber reinforced with layers of steel and concrete, designed to withstand any breach. But would it be enough? We set up the trap, using the last of the tranquilizer and some high-voltage electric grids we rigged together in a makeshift fashion. Everything was ready, and all we could do was wait. It didn't take long. Sable, relentless in its pursuit, followed the scent of its prey. The door to the vault opened, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. The creature stalked into the room, its body shifting and rippling as it adjusted to the dim light. It sniffed the air, eyes narrowing as it sensed the trap. "Now!" I yelled, and we activated the grid. The room lit up in a blaze of electricity, sparks of blue lightning dancing across the creature's body. It screamed a horrible, inhuman sound as the current surged through it. For a moment, I thought it might not be enough, but then the creature convulsed and collapsed to the floor, twitching as the electricity fried its nervous system. When the lights dimmed, the creature lay still, a smoking, charred mass on the ground. It was dead. We stood there, breathing heavily, the reality of what we had just done settling over us like a shroud. The threat was over, but the cost was high. Kane was gone, and so were the guards Sable had slaughtered. The facility would need to be purged, the evidence of what had happened here buried deep, just like everything else in this place. As we left the vault, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had crossed a line we were never meant to. Sable was just one experiment, one monster among many that we had created in our arrogance. "Is it over?" Yara asked quietly as we walked back through the empty corridors. "For now," I replied, and that was the truth. We had won this battle, but the war was far from over. My name is Rory McAllister. I've spent the better part of my career working for the U.S. government, specifically in one of those jobs where the details are sealed away under layers of classified nonsense. If you asked, I'd tell you I was an engineer, a problem solver of sorts. But that wouldn't scratch the surface of what I've seen or what I've done. For over 15 years, I've been stationed at a secluded facility deep in the Montana wilderness. A place where the line between man and machine, animal and monster, has been aggressively blurred. The project I'm part of is known as Genesis 17, an unholy marriage of genetic manipulation and cybernetics. The idea was to create a new breed of soldiers, ones that could outperform anything human. We started with enhancing physical abilities, but soon the higher-ups got greedy. They wanted more: intelligence, strength, speed, and adaptability. And in that pursuit, we crossed lines no one should ever cross. The facility itself is buried deep within a mountain range. It's designed to be both a lab and a prison, with long, sterile corridors, reinforced cells, and observation rooms that could double as cages. The place is cold, both in temperature and spirit. It's the kind of place where hope comes to die, and for good reason. Nothing good ever came from Genesis 17. The day it all went wrong started like any other. The cold mountain air bit at my face as I entered the facility, passing the armed guards who, despite their apparent confidence, seemed to be carrying an invisible weight. They knew what we were working on, what we were trying to contain. They knew the danger. My job was to monitor Subject Alpha, one of our first successful hybrids. It had been created using a combination of gorilla DNA, human neural tissue, and a few other components that I'm not at liberty to discuss. Let's just say that Alpha was big, fast, and mean. Everything you wouldn't want to meet in a dark alley. Alpha was kept in one of the deepest parts of the facility, in a cell specifically designed to hold something of its nature. The walls were reinforced with titanium alloy, and the doors were secured with an electromagnetic locking system that would take a tank to break through. We thought it was enough. We were wrong. As I sat in the control room, watching Alpha through a monitor, something strange happened. Its normally calm, almost subdued demeanor changed. Alpha began to pace back and forth in its cell, agitated. Its eyes, those damned eyes, darting around like it was searching for something. Then, without warning, it stopped, turned, and stared directly at the camera. A chill ran through me. It wasn't just looking at the camera, it was looking at me. I felt it. There was an intelligence there. Something more than just the animalistic instincts we had seen before. It was as if Alpha knew what was coming. "Rory," a voice crackled through the intercom, pulling me out of my thoughts. It was Dr. Ingrid Nolan, the head geneticist and my only real friend in this godforsaken place. "We're detecting elevated cortisol levels in Alpha. What's going on down there?" "I don't know," I replied, my voice shaking more than I'd like to admit. "It's agitated. This isn't normal." "Keep an eye on it," she said. "I'll be down in a few minutes." Before I could respond, the monitor flickered, and then the entire facility was plunged into darkness. The backup generators kicked in almost immediately, bathing everything in a dim red glow. But by then, I knew we were in trouble. "Shit," I muttered, pulling up the security feeds. The cameras showed nothing but static. "Ingrid, are you seeing this?" There was no response. I cursed again, grabbing the radio from the console. "Ingrid, come in, do you copy?" Still nothing. Panic began to rise in my chest, but I forced it down. Panicking wouldn't help. I needed to think. Alpha's cell was just a few corridors down from the control room. I grabbed the flashlight from my desk and headed out, moving quickly through the dimly lit hallways. Every sound seemed amplified. The hum of the generators, the distant clang of metal, the pounding of my own heart. When I reached Alpha's cell, the door was wide open. My breath caught in my throat. The electromagnetic locks had failed. The only thing keeping Alpha contained now was the small room I stood in, and that wasn't going to hold it for long. "Alpha!" I shouted, hoping against hope that it was still in the cell. But I knew better. It was out. It was loose. I spun around, scanning the hallway with the flashlight. That's when I heard it. A low rumbling noise that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The sound was almost animalistic, but with an unsettling metallic undertone like the grinding of gears. Then, from the shadows at the far end of the corridor, it emerged. Alpha had changed. It was still the massive, hulking creature we had created, but now its skin seemed to shimmer in the red light, reflecting it in strange, distorted patterns. The cybernetic enhancements we had implanted were now visible on the surface, as if they had pushed their way through the flesh. Wires and cables snaked around its body, intertwining with sinew and muscle. Its arms were elongated, ending in claws that looked more like serrated blades than fingers. It was a nightmare made flesh, and it was coming for me. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing through the empty hallways. I knew the layout of the facility like the back of my hand, but that didn't make it any easier. Every corner I turned, I half expected to see Alpha barreling toward me, those terrible claws reaching out. I reached the elevator and slammed my hand on the button, praying it would open in time. The door slid open just as I heard the screeching sound of metal on metal. I turned just in time to see Alpha rounding the corner, its massive form tearing through the corridor like a freight train. The elevator doors closed just as it reached me, and I slammed the button for the top floor. I leaned against the wall, gasping for breath, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. But I wasn't safe yet. The elevator began to ascend, but then with a sudden jolt, it stopped. The lights flickered, and I was plunged into darkness once again. "Come on, come on!" I shouted, banging on the control panel. But it was no use. The power was failing, and the emergency systems weren't enough to keep the elevator going. I was trapped. I fumbled for my radio, hoping against hope that it would work. Ingrid, can you hear me?" A burst of static was my only reply. I cursed under my breath. This was bad. I was alone, stuck between floors with a genetically engineered killing machine on the loose. And then I heard it. The sound of something scraping against the elevator doors. My heart skipped a beat. Alpha had found me. I backed away, pressing myself against the far wall as the sound grew louder. The doors began to buckle under the pressure, the metal groaning as something on the other side tried to force its way in. In a moment of desperation, I pulled out my flashlight and scanned the ceiling. There, a maintenance hatch. It was my only chance. I grabbed the emergency ladder and started to climb, forcing the hatch open with trembling hands. Just as I pulled myself through the hatch, the elevator doors gave way, and Alpha lunged inside. I barely managed to pull the hatch closed behind me, but it was only a temporary reprieve. Alpha was inside now, and it wouldn't take long for it to realize where I'd gone. I scrambled across the top of the elevator looking for a way out. There, a service ladder leading up the shaft. I didn't think. I just climbed. The sound of metal tearing below me spurred me on, faster and faster, until I reached the top. There was a maintenance door, and I threw it open, tumbling into a dimly lit corridor. I slammed the door shut behind me, securing it with a heavy metal bar. For a moment I allowed myself to breathe, but only for a moment. I needed to get to the surface. If I could reach the communications room, I could send a distress signal. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance. I raced through the corridors, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The facility felt like a tomb, the only signs of life, the flickering emergency lights and the distant sounds of Alpha's pursuit. Finally, I reached the communications room. I burst inside, slamming the door behind me. The room was small, filled with outdated equipment and a single ancient radio system. I didn't care. It was my lifeline. I quickly tuned the radio, sending out a distress signal. This is Rory McAllister, Genesis 17 facility. We have a containment breach. I repeat, we have a containment breach. Subject Alpha is loose, requesting immediate assistance. I held my breath, waiting for a response. The seconds stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. Then finally, a voice crackled through the speaker. Roger that, Genesis 17. We're dispatching a response team. Hold tight. I exhaled, relief washing over me. Help was on the way. I wasn't alone in this. But as I turned to leave the room, the door exploded inward, and Alpha was there. It had found me, and this time, there was nowhere to run. I backed away, my eyes locked on the monstrosity before me. It was bigger now, more grotesque. Its body twisted and distorted by the enhancements we had forced upon it. The wires and cables that had once been beneath its skin now writhed like living things, snaking around its limbs. Alpha stepped forward, its claws scraping against the floor. I knew I had seconds, maybe less. In a last-ditch effort, I grabbed the only weapon I had, a fire extinguisher from the wall. I hurled it at Alpha with all my strength. The extinguisher struck it in the chest, and there was a flash of sparks as the metal connected with the machinery. Alpha staggered, its movements becoming erratic. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I ran. I could hear the facility collapsing around me, the generators finally giving out. The walls shook, the lights flickered, and the entire place seemed to be coming apart at the seams. But I kept running, refusing to stop, refusing to give up. I burst through the final door, into the cold mountain air. The facility was on the verge of collapse, and I barely made it out before the entire structure caved in on itself. I stood there, panting as the dust settled around me. The response team arrived moments later, and I watched as they began their cleanup operation, sealing off the area and ensuring that nothing from Genesis 17 would ever see the light of day. Alpha was gone, buried beneath tons of rock and debris. It was over, or so I thought. My name is Curtis Bannon, and I've been working for the government for close to 11 years now. Mostly, it's been boring, a lot of data entry and pushing papers. But recently, I was transferred to a place that I think might be the reason people start believing in conspiracy theories. It's a secluded facility somewhere in the middle of the Arizona desert. No name on the maps, no cell service. And the only way in is by a government convoy that picks us up from a small airstrip at the edge of a forgotten town. The facility is known as Site 12, but we call it the Pit. It's a concrete labyrinth, all cold corridors and steel doors. The place reeks of bleach and something else I can't quite place. Something more organic. My job here is simple, or at least it was supposed to be. Observe and report. I'm part of a team overseeing an experiment called Project Lerna. The name itself sounds harmless enough, but what it involves is anything but. I was briefed on Project Lerna during my first week. Genetic modification, they said, using a hybrid DNA sequence from various sources, human, animal, and something else. They never clarified what the something else was, and frankly, I didn't want to know. The goal was to create a new type of organism, one that could adapt to any environment, with rapid regenerative abilities and an unmatched capacity for intelligence. The lab where the organism was kept, Lerna Unit, was off limits to most personnel, including me. My role was to monitor the data from the organism's vital signs and behaviors, which were transmitted to a secure server that I had access to. It wasn't until 3 months into my assignment that things started going wrong. The first sign was a spike in the organism's neural activity. I noticed it one night while I was going through the usual data. Its brainwaves were off the charts, fluctuating wildly in a pattern I had never seen before. I reported it to Dr. Evelyn Stark, the lead geneticist on the project, but she brushed it off, saying it was probably just a side effect of the new stimulus they had introduced. I didn't push the issue, though something about it bothered me. 2 days later, the alarms went off in the middle of the night. A siren blared throughout the facility, the kind that drills into your skull and makes your bones vibrate. I shot out of bed, pulled on my uniform, and followed the flashing red lights to the control room. There, I found Dr. Stark and the rest of the team huddled around the monitors, faces pale and drawn. "It's loose," Stark said, her voice hollow. The creature, it escaped containment. My stomach dropped. The organism, which they had been calling Subject Theta, had apparently broken through the reinforced glass of its cell with ease. The footage showed it using its limbs, long, sinewy things that looked more like a spider's legs than anything human, to smash through the barriers. Then it vanished into the labyrinth of tunnels that connected the labs. We locked down the facility immediately, sealing off sections as we tracked its movements. But the creature was fast, intelligent, and far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. It moved through the shadows, avoiding the cameras with a cunning that made my skin crawl. The first body was found in the East Wing, Tanner, one of the lab techs. His body was a mangled mess, limbs twisted at unnatural angles, his chest torn open as if something had dug into him, searching for something vital. There wasn't a clean kill. It was brutal, messy, and deliberate. Whatever Theta was, it wasn't just trying to escape. It was hunting. Panic set in quickly. We were stuck in the facility, unable to leave until Theta was either recaptured or killed. Dr. Stark tried to maintain order, but it was clear she was just as terrified as the rest of us. The only weapons we had were some outdated rifles stored in the security lockers, barely enough to take down a regular person, let alone whatever Theta had become. As the hours dragged on, the tension mounted. People started disappearing, some during patrols, others from the barracks. The cameras only caught glimpses of Theta, a flash of something pale, the glint of light off its sleek body as it moved through the corridors with terrifying speed. It was learning our routines, anticipating our movements. I teamed up with a guy named Martin, one of the few security personnel left. He was jittery, sweating through his uniform, but he kept his grip tight on his rifle. We decided to sweep the North Wing, where we last saw Theta on the monitors. The air was thick with the smell of decay. The walls seemed to close in around us as we moved deeper into the darkened corridors. We found more bodies, or what was left of them. It wasn't just killing for survival, it was experimenting, dissecting. The horror of it all made my head swim, but I couldn't afford to lose focus. I had to stay sharp, stay alive. Then we heard it, this faint scratching sound like claws on metal. It echoed down the hallway, followed by a low, rhythmic clicking noise. Martin and I exchanged a look. He nodded, and we slowly made our way towards the sound, rifles raised. We turned the corner, and there it was, Theta, hunched over a corpse, its body pulsating as it tore into the flesh with elongated jaws that resembled something between a lizard and an insect. Its form was in constant flux, shifting and morphing as it devoured its prey, skin stretching over a bony, sinewy frame. Martin panicked. He fired a shot that went wide, the noise echoing through the corridor. Theta whipped around, its jaws snapping shut with a sound like breaking bones. Before Martin could fire again, it lunged at him, those spider-like limbs wrapping around his body, lifting him off the ground as it squeezed. I heard Martin scream, a wet, gurgling noise that cut off suddenly as Theta bit down on his neck, tearing it out with a sickening crunch. My brain screamed at me to run, but my legs were frozen. Theta dropped Martin's lifeless body and turned its head towards me. Its face, or what passed for one, was an abomination, a grotesque mix of reptilian and mammalian features covered in glistening patches of dark, almost scaly skin. It had no eyes, but I could feel it staring at me, studying me, deciding what to do next. I backed away slowly, keeping my rifle trained on it. Theta didn't move for a moment, as if it was calculating its next move. Then, in a blur, it charged. Instinct took over. I fired blindly, the recoil slamming into my shoulder as I emptied the clip. The bullets tore into Theta, and for a second, I thought it might go down. But then it reared back, a deep, shuddering growl reverberating through the hallway. I could see the wounds knitting themselves back together, flesh reforming as quickly as it had been torn apart. I was out of options. I turned and ran, my boots pounding against the metal floor, heart hammering in my chest. Behind me, I heard Theta give chase, its limbs scuttling against the walls, closing the distance. I had one chance, get to the Lerna unit. There they had the only thing that might stop this creature, a containment field designed to neutralize anything organic. If I could lure Theta inside and activate the field, it might just be enough to kill it. The corridors blurred together as I ran, the creature gaining on me with every step. I could feel its hot breath on the back of my neck, its jaws snapping just inches away. Finally, I reached the door to the learner unit, slamming my hand against the panel to open it. I dove inside, barely making it through before the doors shut behind me. Theta crashed into the door with a deafening impact, the metal buckling but holding. I scrambled to the control panel, my hands shaking as I activated the containment field. The room flooded with a high-pitched hum, and I saw Theta convulse on the other side of the glass, its body seizing as the field took effect. For a moment, I thought it might work. Theta thrashed against the glass, its form glitching, shifting in and out of focus. But then it began to change again, adapting to the field. I watched in horror as it forced its way through the containment barrier, its body twisting into a grotesque shape that defied logic. I had no time to think. I grabbed the emergency lockdown lever and pulled it with all my strength. The room was flooded with a blinding light as the entire unit went into full lockdown. Theta let out a sound that I'll never forget, a screech of pure agony as the system overloaded. When the light faded, I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. Theta was nothing more than a charred husk, its once terrifying form reduced to a smoldering pile of ash and bone. I didn't stick around after that. The facility was in shambles, bodies everywhere, but I knew I had to get out. I made my way to the surface, where the convoy was already waiting, alerted by the automated distress signals. They didn't ask any questions as I boarded, just whisked me away from that hellish place. No one ever mentioned Site 12 or Project Lerna again. It was as if it never existed, wiped from the records. But I know what happened. And I know that somewhere deep in the files of some government black site there's still a record of the creature that almost killed me, a creature that should never have existed. They told me the job was routine, just another day at the facility, checking on the progress of Project Cobalt. I'm Jareth Dunbar, and I've been working with the government for years on classified genetic research. We're out in the middle of nowhere, an old military base buried deep in the forests of Colorado, miles from the nearest town. The facility is underground, sterile and windowless, filled with the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant murmur of equipment running day and night. Project Cobalt was supposed to be a breakthrough. We were splicing genes from different species, pushing the boundaries of what was possible. They told us it was for medical advancements, that we were on the verge of curing diseases. But I always suspected there was more to it. The project was shrouded in secrecy, with only a handful of us knowing the full extent of what we were creating. The facility itself is massive, with endless corridors that all look the same. The lab I work in is down in the lower levels, isolated from the rest. The walls are thick, the doors heavy, designed to contain anything and anyone that might pose a threat. But what we didn't realize, what none of us could have anticipated, was that something was already loose inside. It started with small things. A security guard missing from his post, bloodstains found in a hallway, a door left ajar when it should have been sealed tight. We thought it was a malfunction, a glitch in the system. We were wrong. Yesterday I was called into a meeting with Dr. Marquez, the head of the project, and a few other top-level scientists. Marquez looked haggard, his usual confidence replaced with a nervous edge. He told us that one of the test subjects had escaped. Not just any test subject, Subject Delta, the most advanced of the experiments, a creature we had engineered to be stronger, faster, more resilient than anything nature had ever produced. Delta wasn't just an animal. We had spliced its DNA with that of several different species, blending the traits of a panther, a bear, and a python. The result was something monstrous, something with the speed and agility of a cat, the brute strength of a bear, and the constriction ability of a python. But what made Delta truly terrifying was its intelligence. We had used human DNA as a base, tweaking it, enhancing it, trying to create something that could think strategically, adapt quickly, and solve complex problems. We succeeded. We spent the night combing through security footage, but Delta was always one step ahead, avoiding cameras, staying in the shadows. Marquez ordered a full lockdown, sealing off sections of the facility as we tried to contain the breach. But it was too late. This morning, I found Dr. Lee in the corridor outside my lab. Or rather, I found what was left of him. His body was torn apart, his limbs twisted at unnatural angles, bones protruding through his skin. His eyes were wide open, frozen in terror. I don't know what hit me harder, the sight of his mangled body or the realization that Delta had done this with its bare hands. Whatever we had created, it wasn't just an animal. It was a predator. Panic started to spread through the facility. People were on edge, jumpy, snapping at each other. We knew we were trapped down here, deep underground, with no way out until the lockdown was lifted. The air was thick with fear, the kind that grips your chest and squeezes, making it hard to breathe. But I kept telling myself that we could handle this, that we were professionals. We were wrong again. By midday, the power started flickering. At first, it was just the lights, a momentary dimming before they came back on. Then, the doors began to malfunction. They would open and close on their own, sealing people in or out of rooms at random. Marquez ordered everyone to the central control room, thinking we'd be safer there, but it was a mistake. We were herded into one place, easy pickings for whatever was out there. I stayed behind in the lab trying to restore the systems. I thought maybe I could find a way to override the lockdown, get us out of here. I lost track of time, hunched over the computer terminal, when the door behind me slid open with a hiss. I didn't hear it at first, too absorbed in my work. But then I felt it, a presence, something heavy and oppressive, like the air had been sucked out of the room. I turned slowly, heart pounding, and there it was, Delta, crouched in the doorway, its massive form filling the frame. It was covered in blood, fresh and wet, staining the dark fur that covered its body. Its head was low, shoulders hunched, muscles rippling beneath its skin. But it was the face that made my stomach churn. It was almost human, but the eyes were all wrong. Too large, too intelligent, too aware. This was no mindless beast. It was calculating, assessing me, and I knew in that moment it was deciding whether I was worth the effort. I didn't wait for it to make up its mind. I bolted for the emergency exit, slamming my hand on the button that would seal the lab. The door slammed shut behind me, but I knew it wouldn't hold for long. Delta was strong, and these doors weren't made to withstand the kind of force it could exert. I ran down the corridor, my breath coming in ragged gasps, trying to think of where I could go, where I could hide. The facility was a maze, and I was lost in it, running on instinct. I could hear it behind me, the sound of its heavy footfalls, the scrape of claws against the metal floor. It wasn't in a hurry. It knew I had nowhere to go. I stumbled into a storage room, slamming the door behind me, and pressed myself against the far wall, trying to steady my breathing. The room was dark, the only light coming from a flickering bulb overhead. My heart was racing, my mind a blur of panic and fear. I could hear it outside, sniffing, its claws tapping lightly against the door, almost as if it was toying with me. I glanced around the room, searching for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes fell on a steel pipe, half hidden under a pile of boxes. I grabbed it, gripping it tightly, knowing it was a futile gesture but needing to feel like I had some kind of defense. The door handle rattled, and then the door began to bend inward, the metal creaking under the strain. I backed up against the wall, raising the pipe, my hands shaking. This was it. I was going to die in this godforsaken place, torn apart by the very thing we had created. The door burst open, and Delta stepped into the room. It moved with a grace that was almost surreal, its eyes locking onto mine. It tilted its head slightly, as if curious, before it lunged. I swung the pipe with all my strength, feeling it connect with a sickening thud, but it was like hitting a brick wall. Delta didn't even flinch. It grabbed me, its grip like a vice, and threw me across the room. I hit the wall hard, the air knocked out of me, the pipe clattering to the floor. I looked up just in time to see Delta closing in, its mouth opening to reveal rows of sharp teeth, and then darkness. When I came to, the room was silent. Delta was gone, the door hanging off its hinges, the corridor beyond empty. I don't know why it didn't kill me. Maybe it didn't see me as a threat. Maybe it wanted to save me for later. Or maybe it was playing with me. A cat toying with a mouse, letting me think I had a chance before it came back to finish the job. I dragged myself to my feet, every muscle in my body screaming in pain. I needed to find a way out, find help, but I knew that the facility was still in lockdown, but there was no escape until someone from the outside lifted it. And with Delta on the loose, I didn't know how many of us were left. I staggered out into the corridor, the lights flickering, casting long shadows on the walls. The place was a tomb, silent except for the distant hum of the generators. I knew I couldn't stay here, couldn't wait for Delta to come back. I had to keep moving, had to find a way to survive until help arrived. But as I turned the corner, I froze. There, at the end of the hall, was Marquez, or what was left of him. He was slumped against the wall, his body torn open, blood pooling around him. His eyes were still open, but there was no life in them. Delta had found him first. I stumbled back, my mind reeling, and that's when I heard it. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from behind me. I turned, my heart leaping into my throat. It wasn't Delta. It was a team of soldiers, armed to the teeth, their faces grim. They had finally arrived to contain the situation, to clean up the mess we had made. They didn't ask questions. They didn't need to. They took one look at me covered in blood, barely standing, and knew everything they needed to know. One of them, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, nodded to me. "You're safe now," he said, his voice calm, controlled. I nodded back, too exhausted to speak, too numb to feel anything. As they escorted me out, I didn't look back. There was nothing left for me here, nothing but death and regret. But I knew, deep down, that Delta was still out there, somewhere in the dark, waiting for its next victim. And I was glad I wasn't going to be it. My name is Edgar Welsh, and until last week, I was a genetic researcher at a government facility tucked away in the middle of nowhere. The kind of place that doesn't show up on maps and is hidden behind layers of bureaucratic jargon that mean nothing to anyone outside our circle. Project Murmur, as it was called, was my life for the past 5 years. I wasn't always a government lab rat, though. I used to be a professor, one of those stuffy academics who believed in ethics and the greater good. That was before I realized the truth. The greater good is subjective, and ethics are as flexible as a rubber band. The facility was like a bunker, deep underground, insulated from the outside world by reinforced concrete and the cold logic of national security. We worked with things that most people couldn't comprehend, nor would they want to. My specialty was genetic splicing, blending DNA from various species to create something new. The official line was that we were searching for medical breakthroughs, but I knew better. We were building weapons, things that could think, adapt, and survive in ways nothing natural could. The project started with something small, something controllable. We called it Specimen X-12, a blend of canine, reptilian, and primate DNA. It was supposed to be intelligent, strong, and obedient, a perfect soldier for the wars of the future. What we ended up with was something altogether different. When X-12 was young, it seemed docile enough, even playful at times. But as it grew, it became apparent that we had created something far more dangerous. It was intelligent, yes, but also cunning, and worst of all, resentful. It started with the way it looked at us through the thick glass of its containment unit, as if it were plotting, biding its time. I should have walked away then, should have quit and gone back to my university lectures and my ethical debates. But I didn't. I was too intrigued, too invested in what we were doing. I convinced myself that we could control it, that we were too smart to let things get out of hand. I was wrong. 2 days ago, X-12 escaped. How? We don't know. One moment, the containment unit was secured. The next, alarms were blaring and the lights were flickering, plunging the facility into intermittent darkness. The security footage showed nothing. One moment it was there, and the next the glass was shattered and it was gone. Panic set in immediately. The facility went into lockdown, but by then it was too late. X-12 was loose and we were trapped underground with it. There was no protocol for this, no plan in place for when the experiment turns on the experimenters. We were left to fend for ourselves. We split into groups, searching the labyrinth of corridors and labs, hoping to corner it, contain it again. I was with Dr. Levy and Harris, both good men, smart and level-headed. We moved carefully, slowly, armed with tranquilizer guns that I suspected would be about as effective as a fly swatter on a grizzly bear. We found the first body in the storage room, Corporal Anders. He'd been one of the security team, a tough guy, ex-military. His body was a mess, torn apart in a way that no human or animal could have done. It was like someone had taken a butcher's knife to him, hacking and slashing until there was nothing left but a pile of meat and bone. I remember Dr. Levy gagging at the sight, and I couldn't blame him. I felt sick too, but more than that, I felt fear. Real cold fear that I hadn't felt since I was a child. We moved on, more cautiously now. Every sound, every flicker of the lights set us on edge. We knew X-12 was close, but we didn't know where. We reached the lab where it had been kept, thinking maybe it had returned to its original spot. The glass was everywhere, the containment unit shattered from the inside. And then we saw it. X-12, standing in the middle of the room, its back to us, hunched over something. At first, I thought it was feeding, but then I realized it was holding something, cradling it almost. It was one of the lab assistants, Samantha, a young woman fresh out of grad school, who'd been so eager to be part of something bigger than herself. Her body was limp, her head lolling to one side, eyes wide open in a frozen expression of terror. Harris fired the first shot, and it was a mistake. The tranquilizer dart hit X-12 in the back, but instead of dropping, it turned slowly to face us, letting Samantha's body fall to the ground like a discarded toy. I saw its face clearly for the first time, if you could call it a face. It was an unnatural blend of features, part wolf, part lizard, with hints of something else, something not from this world. Its mouth was too wide, too full of teeth, and it had this expression, like it was smiling, like it knew something we didn't. It moved fast, faster than anything I'd ever seen. Before Harris could reload, X-12 was on him, claws ripping through his chest. I heard him scream, saw the blood splatter on the walls, and I ran. I didn't look back, not once. I heard Dr. Levy behind me, his footsteps echoing in the narrow corridor, but then there was nothing. Silence. And I knew he was gone too. I reached the control room, the place where we could initiate a full facility purge, flooding the labs with a gas that was supposed to neutralize any biological threat. It was our last resort, a failsafe that was never supposed to be used. I hit the button, watched as the gas began to pour into the ventilation system, hoping against hope that it would work. For a moment I thought it did. The alarm stopped and the lights stabilized, giving the illusion of safety. But then I heard it, a scratching at the door, low and persistent. X-12 wasn't dead. It had survived the gas, and now it was here, hunting me. I backed away from the door, looking for anything I could use as a weapon, but there was nothing. Just cold, sterile equipment that wouldn't do a damn thing against what was coming. I was trapped, and I knew it. The door began to buckle under the force of X-12's assault, the metal bending inward. I knew it would only be a matter of seconds before it got through. I glanced around the room, my mind racing. Then I saw it. The emergency lockdown switch. It was meant to seal the control room completely, cutting off all air and power, essentially turning the room into a tomb. I had no other choice. I hit the switch and the door sealed shut just as X-12 broke through. There was a moment of silence, then a loud thud as it hit the barrier. I sat there in the dark, listening to it scratching at the door, relentless. The power went out a minute later, and the air started to thin. I knew I didn't have much time. I found a flashlight and flicked it on, the weak beam casting long shadows on the walls. I could still hear X-12 outside, pacing, searching for a way in. Then, suddenly, the scratching stopped. Silence. I waited, every nerve in my body on edge, but there was nothing. No sound, no movement. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, but it could have been minutes. Time didn't make sense anymore. Finally, the power came back on, and with it, the ventilation system. Fresh air flooded the room, and the lights flickered back to life. I stood up, legs shaky, and moved to the door, pressing my ear against it. Nothing. I opened it cautiously, expecting X-12 to lunge at me, but the corridor was empty. I stepped out, flashlight in hand, and walked through the facility, expecting to find more bodies, more carnage. But there was nothing, just the silence of an empty lab. X-12 was gone. I don't know how, and I don't know where it went, but it was gone. And for the first time in hours I felt a glimmer of hope. I made my way to the exit, through the maze of corridors, past the shattered containment units, and the bloodstains that would never wash out. The sunlight hit me like a wave as I stepped outside, and I breathed in the fresh air, grateful to be alive. I've been debriefed since then, told to forget everything that happened, that it was all classified, top secret. But I can't forget. The facility is sealed now, locked down by the military, and I've been reassigned. They say it's a promotion, but I know better. They want me to disappear, to become just another cog in the machine. But I won't. I'm not going to let this go. I'm going to find out where X-12 went, what happened to it. Because I know it's out there somewhere waiting, and I'm not going to stop until I find it, or until it finds me. I always thought working for the government was going to be just another job. Sure, it was a bit more prestigious than my last gig at the research lab, but at the end of the day, I figured it was just another way to pay the bills. My name's Sam Garner, and I'm a geneticist by trade. A few years back, I got recruited by a branch of the government for a project so classified, I had to sign documents swearing I'd never even hint about its existence. I thought I knew what I was getting into, but nothing could have prepared me for what went down last week. The project, officially known as Codex Rebirth, was buried so deep in bureaucracy and red tape that even those of us working on it had only the faintest idea of the bigger picture. It was all compartmentalized. I knew just my slice of the pie. My team was focused on gene splicing, combining animal and human DNA in ways that had never been done before. They told us it was about developing new treatments for diseases, unlocking the potential of the human genome by mixing it with the most resilient traits in nature. But the further we dug into it, the less it felt like science, and the more it felt like playing God. The facility was isolated, hidden in the dense forests of northern Idaho, surrounded by nothing but miles of trees and mountains. The kind of place you could scream your lungs out, and no one would hear you. We worked long hours in cold, sterile labs, surrounded by cutting-edge technology and the hum of fluorescent lights. Despite the secrecy, there was a camaraderie among the team, a shared sense of purpose, until things started to go wrong. It started small, just anomalies in the subjects we were working on. The usual lab animals began to show signs of unexpected mutations. Nothing too crazy at first. But then the results became increasingly erratic. Cells multiplied at impossible rates, tissue samples developed into bizarre structures, and some of the animals, well, they didn't stay animals for long. Then there was Subject 31, a chimera of sorts, part human, part something else. Its DNA was a cocktail of genes from multiple species, including predators like wolves and eagles, creatures known for their hunting prowess. The theory was that combining these would create something with heightened senses, strength, and maybe even some form of human intelligence. But when Subject 31 was born, it wasn't just an experiment, it was a nightmare. The first time I saw it, I knew something was off. It had the basic shape of a man, but the proportions were all wrong. Limbs too long, torso too short, and a head that was more of a twisted fusion of human and beast. Its skin was a patchwork of fur, scales, and rough, leathery patches. But what really set my teeth on edge was its movement. It didn't walk. It prowled, each step deliberate, as if it was already calculating its next move. For weeks, we kept it in a secure containment unit, observing it, running tests, trying to understand what we had created. And every day, it seemed to learn more, adapting faster than we could measure. It had a way of looking at you, not with its eyes, because I swear they were empty, but with something deeper, something primal that made you feel like prey. 2 days before everything went to hell, Subject 31 killed its handler. The guy was a seasoned vet, used to dealing with dangerous animals, but nothing could have prepared him for this. It happened fast, faster than we could react. One moment, the handler was in the cage, delivering a meal. The next, he was on the floor, his throat torn out, his body ripped apart like it was nothing. The thing didn't eat him, didn't even seem interested in the body after it was done. It just stared at us through the reinforced glass, daring us to make the next move. That was when the lockdown happened. The higher-ups ordered the facility sealed, and we were all confined to the labs. They wanted to study the aftermath, see if there was any way to control what we had unleashed. But by then it was too late. Subject 31 had learned too much. It escaped the next night, tearing through metal and concrete like it was paper. The alarms blared, red lights flashing through the sterile halls, but I was already on the move. I didn't wait for orders. I knew that thing was coming for us next. I grabbed what I could, a tranquilizer gun, a few syringes of a potent neurotoxin, anything that might give me a fighting chance, and headed for the security room. On the way, I ran into Dr. Elise Chambers, a colleague and friend who had been working on the behavioral studies. Her face was pale, her hands shaking. "Sam, we have to get out of here. It's not just 31. It triggered something in the other subjects. They're all breaking out." "What do you mean, all?" I asked, but the answer didn't matter. I knew then that we were beyond saving the facility. It was about surviving the next few hours. Together, we made our way to the control center, trying to stay ahead of the chaos. The facility was in total disarray. Doors were ripped off hinges, the power flickered, and in the distance I could hear screams. Not the usual panicked cries, but something deeper, more desperate. I knew it wasn't just the staff. The creatures we had engineered, the ones that were supposed to be contained, were loose. They were hunting. When we reached the control room, we found it deserted, the monitor showing scenes of carnage from all over the facility. Subject 31 was on one screen, moving with unnatural speed, its distorted body a blur as it hunted down the guards. But there were others too, creatures that had once been ordinary lab animals, now twisted beyond recognition. One had the head of a lion, but its body was covered in reptilian scales, and it moved on all fours with the fluidity of a snake. Another was a mass of tentacles and fur, a grotesque amalgamation that shouldn't have been able to move, but it did, and with deadly intent. Elise started pulling up security protocols, trying to activate any remaining defenses, but most of the systems were offline, either destroyed by the creatures or shut down during the lockdown. "We're not going to make it out of here if we don't find a way to trap them," she said, her voice tight with fear. "Trap them? We need to kill them," I replied, loading the tranquilizer gun with the neurotoxin darts. "These things aren't just going to stop." She nodded, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. We both knew that whatever we were facing was beyond anything we had prepared for. As we moved through the facility, trying to avoid the roaming creatures, we heard the sounds of metal scraping against concrete, the occasional crash, and the low rumbling noises that seemed to reverberate through the walls. At one point, we came across the remains of another team member, his body mangled beyond recognition. Elise turned away, gagging, but I couldn't take my eyes off it. This was what we had created. We finally made it to one of the containment cells that was still intact, a room designed to hold one of the more aggressive subjects. It was reinforced with layers of steel, concrete, and shock absorbers to prevent any escape. "This might be our only chance," I said, checking the room's integrity. Elise was already at the control panel, setting up a manual override to seal the room once Subject 31, or whatever else was following us, was inside. "We'll have to lure it in," she said, her voice shaky. "But how?" I glanced at the mangled body in the hallway, an idea forming. "Bait," I said, my voice cold. "We use the remains. These things are predators. They'll follow the scent." It was a gruesome task, dragging what was left of our colleague into the cell, but there was no time for second thoughts. As we worked, I could feel the weight of what we were doing, the realization that we were fighting for our lives with the remnants of our own mistakes. When the trap was set, we retreated to a nearby room, using the facility's intercom system to broadcast the sounds that might lure the creatures. Elise watched the monitors. her finger hovering over the button that would seal the cell once something was inside. Minutes passed, each one stretching into an eternity. The tension in the room was suffocating. Then, we saw it. Subject 31, moving with terrifying speed down the corridor, its twisted form almost too fast to follow. It paused at the entrance to the cell, sniffing the air before entering cautiously. "Now," I whispered, and Elise slammed her hand down on the button. The door to the containment cell slid shut with a heavy clang, the sound echoing through the empty halls. For a moment, I thought we had done it. But then the walls shook, a low, powerful impact from within as Subject 31 tested its new prison. "That's not going to hold it," Elise said, her voice barely a whisper. "I know," I replied, but I was already moving, pulling out the last syringe of neurotoxin. "But it'll slow it down." The creature slammed against the walls again, and I knew we had only moments before it would break free. I approached the reinforced glass panel that allowed us to view the cell's interior, trying to get a clear shot. But as I raised the tranquilizer gun, something happened that I hadn't anticipated. The creature turned, its empty gaze locking onto mine through the glass. It wasn't just watching me, it was studying me. And in that moment, I realized it had learned more than just physical strength from the genes we had spliced into it. It had learned strategy. Before I could react, Subject 31 rammed into the glass with all its might, cracking the surface in a spiderweb of fractures. I fired the dart, but the creature was already in motion, too fast for me to aim properly. The dart hit its shoulder, but it barely slowed down as it charged again. This time, the glass shattered, and I was thrown backward by the force of the impact. My vision blurred as I hit the floor, but I saw Elise, standing frozen by the control panel, her face a mask of terror. I struggled to my feet, knowing I had only seconds. The creature was in the room with us now, its twisted form looming over me. But it wasn't attacking, it was waiting, calculating its next move. It knew it had the advantage. With the last of my strength, I lunged forward, driving the syringe directly into the creature's chest. It reared back, letting out a sound that was more mechanical than organic, a fusion of the many parts that had been forced together to create it. For a moment I thought it would keep coming, but then its body convulsed, the neurotoxin taking effect. It staggered, its movements becoming erratic, and then it collapsed, twitching violently as the poison shut down its systems. Elise rushed to my side, helping me to my feet as we watched the creature thrash in its death throes. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, it lay still. "We did it," she said, her voice weak with relief. "Yeah," I replied, staring at the remains of Subject 31. "It's over." We left the facility shortly after that, leaving the cleanup to the military team that arrived in the aftermath. The bodies were all there, the evidence undeniable. What we had created could never be erased, but at least it was finally contained. I can still remember the hum of the fluorescent lights and the sterile smell of the lab that clung to my clothes long after I left for the day. I wasn't particularly proud of the work I did, but it paid the bills and kept me in the government's good graces. Besides, who else was going to unravel the mysteries of genetics at the U.S. government's most secluded facility? My name is Evan Leclerc, and I've been working on secret genetic experiments for what feels like a lifetime, though I know it's only been 10 years. It's hard to keep track of time when every day bleeds into the next, and the only thing that changes is the sequence of genes you're trying to manipulate. The project I was assigned to was called Project Seraphim. The goal was ambitious, almost godlike in its scope. Create a being with enhanced cognitive abilities, superior strength, and an immunity to disease. It was supposed to be the next step in human evolution, the perfect soldier. But the road to perfection is fraught with missteps, and in our pursuit of the impossible, we ended up with something else entirely. It started with subtle signs that something was wrong. Animals in the vivarium went missing, their cages left open despite the high security locks. At first we thought it was a glitch, an anomaly in the system that monitored the labs. Then there were the noises, scratches, shuffling footsteps, something too fast to be seen on the security cameras, but always just on the edge of the frame. The staff began whispering about the shadow, a creature born from our experiments that prowled the darkened corridors. I didn't believe in the shadow, not until the night I was working late in Lab 42, trying to stabilize the latest genetic sequence. It was past midnight, and the facility was empty except for the occasional security patrol. I heard a low scraping sound behind me, something dragging along the cold, tiled floor. I turned, half expecting to see one of the security guards playing a prank, but the lab was empty. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the room, my fingers gripping the edge of the lab bench. Nothing. I shook it off, attributing it to lack of sleep and too much caffeine. I had more important things to worry about, like the fact that our latest creation, Subject XJ13, was not responding as expected. The creature, though human in appearance, was more animalistic in behavior. It had a strange jerky way of moving, its muscles twitching and contracting in ways that defied normal physiology. We had kept it sedated, its body strapped to a gurney, but every day it seemed to grow stronger, more resistant to the tranquilizers we administered. That night, as I turned back to my work, the power in the lab flickered. The lights dimmed and then surged back to life, but the monitors that displayed Subject XJ13's vitals went black. I cursed under my breath, reaching for the emergency flashlight in my desk drawer. The backup generators should have kicked in, but they didn't. I was about to leave the lab to report the outage when I heard it, the sound of metal creaking and snapping, like a steel trap being forced open. I turned slowly, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The gurney was empty, the thick leather straps that had held Subject XJ13 in place torn apart like paper. The door to the containment cell was wide open, swinging slightly on its hinges. My heart raced as I backed toward the exit, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I knew I had to get out, alert the others, but a part of me was frozen, paralyzed by the realization of what we had unleashed. I pressed the panic button on the wall, the one that would alert the entire facility to an emergency. The alarms blared, deafening in the enclosed space, but I knew it was already too late. The shadow was out, and it was hunting. As I ran through the empty corridors, the lights overhead flickering in time with my pounding footsteps, I could hear it, an unnatural clicking sound, like bones snapping back into place, followed by a wet, slithering noise that seemed to come from all directions at once. I made it to the security room where I found Paul Wilkins, the head of security, staring at the surveillance monitors, his face drained of all color. "It's here, Evan," he said, not taking his eyes off the screens. "It's in the ventilation shafts." I looked at the monitors, my stomach dropping. The camera feed showed a blur of movement in the shadows, something too fast and too distorted to make out clearly. But there was no mistaking the predatory intent in its movements as it crawled through the vents, its limbs twisting and bending at impossible angles. "We need to lock down the facility," Paul said, his voice trembling. "Seal off all the exits. Contain it before it can reach the surface." I nodded, knowing it was our only option. But as I reached for the controls to initiate the lockdown, the door behind us burst open with a force that sent us both sprawling to the floor. The creature, XJ13, stood in the doorway, its body a grotesque mockery of the human form. It had the height of a man, but its limbs were elongated, its joints protruding at unnatural angles. Its skin was pale and taut, stretched over muscles that rippled beneath the surface like a living shadow. Its head was a nightmare, a mass of tangled, sinewy flesh that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Where there should have been eyes, there were only deep, sunken voids, and its mouth. Its mouth was a gaping maw filled with rows of needle-like teeth that clicked together as it grinned. Paul was the first to die. The creature moved with a speed that defied physics, closing the distance between them in a heartbeat. It grabbed him by the neck, lifting him off the ground with one hand as if he weighed nothing. Paul's screams were cut short as the creature squeezed, his neck snapping like a twig. It tossed his body aside, turning its attention to me. I scrambled back, my hand closing around the pistol I carried for emergencies. I fired 3 shots, each one hitting the creature in the chest, but it didn't even flinch. The bullets seemed to sink into its flesh, disappearing without leaving a mark. My mind raced, searching for a solution as the creature advanced, its footfalls eerily silent on the tile floor. It reached for me, its fingers curling into claws, but at the last moment I remembered the failsafe. Every lab had one, a button that, when pressed, would release a cloud of neurotoxin, killing everything within the room. It was a last resort, meant to prevent an outbreak in case of containment failure. I lunged for the button, slamming my hand down on it just as the creature's claws grazed my throat. The room filled with a hissing sound as the gas was released. The creature recoiled, its body convulsing as the toxin took effect. It staggered, its limbs thrashing wildly, and for a moment I thought it would escape, but then it collapsed, twitching violently before finally lying still. I watched as its body slowly stopped moving, the life draining from its monstrous form. I stayed there, sitting on the cold floor, waiting until I was sure it was dead. When I finally stood, I saw Paul's body lying a few feet away, his eyes wide open, staring at nothing. I left the facility that night, my mind numb. The cleanup teams arrived soon after, sealing off the lab and removing the creature's remains. They tried to debrief me, but I didn't have much to say. There was nothing left to say. The next morning I was reassigned to a new project in a different facility, miles away from the horrors of Project Seraphim. I packed my things and left without looking back, but every now and then, when I close my eyes, I can still hear that clicking sound, that wet, slithering noise echoing in the back of my mind. But that's just the way things go in this line of work. The facility was sanitized, the files sealed, and the next project began without missing a beat. No loose ends. Nothing to suggest that anything had gone wrong at all. Just another day at the office, and for me, that's all it ever will be. I've never been one to believe in conspiracies or urban legends. I'm a scientist, a man of logic and reason, who trusts in the empirical, the measurable. I've spent my career working on projects that the average person couldn't even comprehend, and I've always taken pride in my work. My name is Dr. Albert Knox, and I was employed by the U.S. government at a secluded facility in the mountains of Montana. My job was to push the boundaries of genetics, to see how far we could stretch the limits of biology without breaking it. The project was called Operation Seraphim, and the goal was to create the perfect soldier. We weren't interested in building muscles or increasing physical endurance. Those things could be achieved with good old-fashioned training. No, we were more concerned with the mental and psychological aspects. We wanted to create a being that was impervious to fear, immune to the trauma of war, a creature that could think faster and react quicker than any human ever could. It sounds like the stuff of science fiction, and perhaps it should have stayed that way. The facility was state-of-the-art, a concrete labyrinth buried deep within the earth, inaccessible to the public and even to most government officials. Only a handful of people knew about our work, and even fewer had clearance to know the full extent of it. The location was chosen not just for its seclusion, but because of the surrounding wilderness, an endless sea of trees and mountains that ensured privacy. The team was small but highly skilled. We had Dr. Emily Greer, a molecular biologist with a knack for gene splicing, and Dr. Samuel Collins, a neurobiologist who specialized in brain-computer interfaces. Then there was myself, the lead geneticist, tasked with overseeing the entire operation. There was also security, of course, a group of military personnel hand-picked for their discretion and loyalty. The first few months went smoothly. We made significant progress in isolating the genes responsible for fear and aggression. We even managed to suppress certain parts of the brain in lab animals, effectively turning off their fight-or-flight response. The next step was to apply this to a more complex organism. That's where things began to spiral out of control. We were given access to a genetic sample from a classified source. We were told it was a specimen of a previously unknown species, something discovered in the depths of the Amazon rainforest. The sample was unlike anything any of us had ever seen before. It contained sequences that didn't match any known organism on Earth. It was as if it had been spliced together from several different species, but with a level of precision that no human technology could achieve. We were hesitant, but the orders came from above. We were to integrate this DNA into a human embryo and monitor the results. So we did. At first, everything seemed fine. The embryo developed normally, showing no signs of rejection or abnormal growth. But as it matured, we began to notice anomalies. The brain was developing at an accelerated rate, and the nervous system was unlike anything we had ever seen before. It was as if the creature was evolving in real time, adapting and changing faster than we could keep up. By the time it reached full term, it was clear that we had created something different. The creature, which we began to refer to as Subject Alpha, looked human enough at first glance, but there were subtle differences. The skin was paler, almost translucent, and the limbs were longer and more slender than they should have been. But it was the eyes, or rather what wasn't in the eyes, that disturbed us the most. There was no sign of consciousness, no flicker of emotion or understanding. It was as if the creature was a machine, designed for one purpose only, to survive. Subject Alpha was kept in a reinforced cell, monitored 24/7 by a team of guards and scientists. It didn't eat, didn't sleep, didn't even blink. It simply sat there, staring at the walls as if waiting for something. We ran tests, tried to engage it in various tasks, but nothing worked. It was as if the creature was in a permanent state of dormancy. Then one night, everything changed. I was in my lab reviewing data when the alarms went off. The entire facility was plunged into chaos. I grabbed my ID badge and ran towards the containment area, my heart pounding in my chest. When I arrived, I was met with a scene straight out of a nightmare. The reinforced glass of Subject Alpha's cell had been shattered from the inside, and the guards were lying in pools of their own blood, their bodies torn apart with a level of brutality I had never seen before. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. How could something like this happen? The creature was supposed to be under control, sedated, monitored. Yet here it was, free and dangerous. I turned to the monitors, hoping to catch a glimpse of where it had gone, but the cameras were all dead. The only thing left was the carnage it had left behind. My first instinct was to get out, to run as far away from this place as possible. But I knew that wasn't an option. The facility was on lockdown, and even if I did manage to escape, I couldn't live with myself knowing I had unleashed this thing into the world. So I did the only thing I could do. I armed myself with the nearest weapon I could find, a standard-issue sidearm from one of the fallen guards, and I set out to find Subject Alpha. The halls were eerily silent as I made my way through the facility. The only sound was the faint hum of the emergency lights flickering overhead. I kept my gun at the ready, my finger on the trigger as I searched for any sign of the creature. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how it had escaped, what it was capable of, and most importantly, how to stop it. I found Dr. Greer in her lab, or rather, what was left of her. She had been dissected in a way that only a creature with an intimate knowledge of anatomy could achieve. Her organs were laid out on the table next to her, each one carefully removed and placed as if for display. It was as if the creature had been studying her, learning from her. I had to fight the urge to vomit as I moved on, my mind reeling from the horror of what I had just witnessed. I found Dr. Collins a few minutes later, or at least, I found his head. The rest of his body was nowhere to be seen. I was alone now, the last one left. And I knew it was only a matter of time before Subject Alpha found me. I heard it before I saw it. A faint clicking sound like nails tapping on the floor. I turned a corner and there it was, standing at the end of the hallway, its head tilted to the side as if it was trying to figure me out. It was taller than before, its limbs longer, more animalistic. But the face was a mockery of humanity, with features that seemed almost human but not quite right. It started to move towards me, slowly at first, as if it was testing me, seeing how I would react. I raised the gun, aimed for the head, and fired. The bullet hit its mark, but the creature didn't go down. It barely even flinched. Instead, it let out a sound, a high-pitched screech that made my ears bleed. And then it was on me. It moved faster than I thought possible, closing the distance between us in a matter of seconds. I fired again and again, emptying the clip into its chest, but it didn't stop. I felt its claws tear into my flesh, felt the hot, wet sensation of my blood spilling out of me. I was going to die here in this god-forsaken place at the hands of my own creation. But then, something unexpected happened. The creature hesitated. It stopped its attack, its head snapping to the side as if it had heard something. And then it just left. It ran down the hallway and disappeared into the darkness, leaving me bleeding and broken on the floor. I don't know why it spared me. Maybe it realized I wasn't a threat, or maybe it had something more important to do. All I know is that I survived, and that I had to get out of there before it changed its mind. I dragged myself to the nearest exit, my vision fading in and out as I lost more and more blood. I don't remember much after that, just flashes of light, the sound of helicopters, and the feeling of cold air on my face as I was lifted out of the facility. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed, my wounds stitched up and bandaged. They told me I had been found just outside the facility, half dead but still breathing. The military had swept in after the alarms went off, but by the time they arrived, the creature was gone. They tried to question me, but I didn't have any answers. I didn't know where Subject Alpha had gone or what it was planning to do. All I knew was that it was out there somewhere, and that it was far more dangerous than anyone could have ever imagined. The facility was shut down, the project scrapped, and the incident classified. But I can't forget what happened. I can't forget the look in the creature's not-quite-human face as it decided to let me live. And I can't forget that somewhere out there in the wilderness, it's still evolving, still adapting, still learning. And I hope to God it doesn't come back. They call it Project Wraith, an attempt to harness the power of genetic modification to create a new breed of soldier. The facility is buried deep within the Mojave Desert, far from prying eyes and even further from accountability. I've worked here for 5 years, just a geneticist trying to make a name for himself in a field that dances on the edge of morality. I wasn't always this way, detached, cynical, and more than a little paranoid. I used to be idealistic, driven by the belief that science could save the world. But after half a decade in this place, watching as our research turned darker with each passing day, I've come to understand that science doesn't always seek the truth. Sometimes it creates its own monsters. The subject we were working on was supposed to be the crown jewel of the project. We called it Subject Epsilon, a creature engineered to possess strength beyond any human, with regenerative abilities that defied natural law. It was a hybrid, a cocktail of predatory DNA and some of our most advanced genetic modifications. A masterpiece, they said, but we underestimated it. How quickly it would adapt, how it would learn, and most terrifyingly, how it would hate. The alarms blared one evening while I was in the lab, monitoring its vitals. My computer screen was flooded with red alerts, data scrolling faster than I could read. Epsilon's heart rate spiked, adrenaline levels soared, and then nothing. The signal was gone. The security team mobilized immediately, locking down the entire facility. Dr. Carson, the lead scientist, rushed into the lab, his face ashen. "It's out," he said, breathless. "It killed 2 guards and disappeared into the air ducts. We need to contain it." Easier said than done. The facility was massive, a labyrinth of sterile corridors, underground bunkers, and hidden chambers. Epsilon could be anywhere, and we were suddenly the prey. Dr. Carson wasn't the panicking type, but I saw fear in his eyes, a cold, calculated fear that told me he knew exactly what Epsilon was capable of. "We need to shut it down," he whispered to me, his voice trembling. "How?" I asked, though I knew the answer. He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw resignation. "We have to override the security protocols and activate the self-destruct sequence." My heart sank. Activating the self-destruct meant wiping out everything, the research, the facility, and everyone inside. But it wasn't just the loss of our work that chilled me. It was the idea that this was the only way to stop Epsilon. As we made our way to the control room, the facility's PA system crackled to life. "Attention all personnel, Subject Epsilon is loose. All staff are to remain in secure locations until further notice." But there were no secure locations. Epsilon moved like a ghost, bypassing cameras and sensors as if it knew exactly how we would try to track it. It left a trail of bodies in its wake, guards, researchers, anyone unfortunate enough to cross its path. The few that survived the initial encounter described it as a nightmare made flesh. They said it moved like a panther, swift and silent, with muscles rippling beneath its skin in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Its face was a twisted blend of human and something far more primal, with teeth that didn't fit quite right in its mouth, jagged and mismatched. It was wrong on a fundamental level, like nature itself had rejected it. As we approached the control room, the lights flickered and the power dimmed. Dr. Carson cursed under his breath. "It's in the system," he said, his fingers flying over the control panel as he tried to regain access. "It's shutting us out." "How can it do that?" I asked, more to myself than to him. Epsilon was intelligent, far more than we'd anticipated. But to manipulate the systems, that was beyond anything we'd imagined. Carson didn't answer, his focus entirely on the screen in front of him. I stood behind him, feeling utterly useless as the minutes ticked by, each one bringing us closer to an inevitable confrontation with the creature we'd created. Suddenly, the door to the control room slammed shut behind us with a heavy thud, followed by the hiss of the airlock ceiling. I spun around to see the lights cut out completely, plunging the room into darkness save for the faint glow of the monitors. Then came the sound. Soft, almost imperceptible, like a whisper of movement. I strained to hear it, every nerve in my body on edge. Carson froze, his hands hovering over the keyboard. "It's here," he breathed. There was no time to react. A shadow moved in the corner of the room, and then it was on him. Epsilon, moving faster than I could comprehend, was a blur of muscle and teeth. Carson didn't even have time to scream as it tore into him, ripping flesh from bone with terrifying precision. I stumbled back, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body refused to obey. I watched in horror as Epsilon dismantled Carson, its movements fluid and methodical. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. Epsilon turned its head toward me, and for a moment I was frozen in its gaze. I could see it, truly see it for the first time. It was no longer just a creature. It was aware, intelligent, and filled with a cold, calculated rage. But instead of attacking, it paused, as if studying me. In that split second, I saw something in its expression. Recognition. It knew who I was, knew that I had been part of the team that created it. And then it spoke. Not in words, but in a low, guttural sound that resonated in my chest, like the growl of a predator. It was communicating, though I couldn't understand the meaning behind the noise. The moment passed, and Epsilon turned away from me, disappearing back into the shadows as quickly as it had arrived. The door hissed open and I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. I should have been dead. It had the chance, but it chose not to kill me. I didn't understand why. Maybe it was saving me for later, or perhaps it had other plans, but I wasn't going to wait to find out. With shaking hands, I crawled over to Carson's mangled body and took his security badge. The control panel was still active, and with a few quick swipes, I initiated the self-destruct sequence. Alarms blared throughout the facility as I sprinted out of the control room, the countdown already ticking away. I didn't look back. I ran through the empty corridors, past the bodies of my colleagues, past the wreckage of what was once a state-of-the-art research facility, and into the desert night. The explosion came as I reached the perimeter, a massive fireball that lit up the sky and sent a shockwave across the desert. I fell to the ground, shielding my head as the heat washed over me. When I finally looked up, all that remained was a smoking crater where the facility had once stood. Epsilon was gone, and with it any trace of our research. I sat there for a long time staring at the destruction, trying to process what had happened. We had created something beyond our control, something that defied everything we knew about science and nature. And in the end, it had nearly destroyed us all. But as I sat there, a single thought crossed my mind. What if it wasn't over? What if Epsilon had survived out there in the desert waiting for its chance to finish what it started? I pushed the thought aside. There was no proof, nothing to suggest that it had escaped the explosion. I had done what I had to do, and the facility was gone. Epsilon was gone. And yet, as I got to my feet and began the long walk back to civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in the vast emptiness of the desert, something was still out there, waiting. But that's not my problem anymore. I've done my part. What comes next, that's someone else's nightmare.